Later, whenever I tell anyone in real life that I'm a socialist, they always say something like, "Oh, so you support evil dictators that kill tens of millions of people like Stalin, right?" And I'm like, boy, I just said that I prefer collective ownership of the means of production. How do you jump from that to me supporting Stalin? Side note, you can also replace Stalin with really any other communist figure, like Mao, Castro, or Putin, even though Putin's even a communist. But back to the topic. I mean, who even was Stalin? There's all these mean rumors flying around and starting to hurt his feelings. What's fact and what's fiction? Josef Rishnovich Dushkavili, hopefully I said that right, was born in 1878 in a small town in Georgia. He was frequently beaten by his father and an only child. After leaving school, Joseph joined the Bolsheviks, a group of militant communists. After the Bolsheviks overthrew the Kerensky government in the October Revolution, Lenin came to power, founding the Soviet Union in 1922 after a bloody civil war. After he died in 1924, Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals and rose to power. So that's your little crash course right there. Now to the juicy stuff. You can hear the rhetoric everywhere. Stalin killed 60 million people, or 50 million people, or 40. Basically, it isn't hard to find huge death counts in the tens of millions. But when you look deeper at these numbers, you'll begin to find that there are two camps. According to Europe a History by Norman Davies, Stalin killed around 50 million people. Let's keep that information tucked in our little chart here. According to that history judged by Roy Medvedev, Stalin killed millions. R.J. Rummel says that 43 million is Stalin's death count. In Health and Social Change in Russia and Eastern Europe by William C. Cockerham, he says that Stalin killed at least 50 million people, citing Norman Davies from earlier. According to Stalinist Terror, New Perspectives, edited by Getty and Manning, there were only 9.5 million surplus deaths during the 1930s. And, according to Victims of Soviet Terror, there were 8 to 9 million deaths during the 30s. Even if we adjust these estimates to apply only to the 1930s, there's still a huge difference with these estimates. The higher number camp has an average of 20 million deaths for the 1930s, while the lower number camp has 8.5 million deaths for the 1930s. What's up with this gap? Well, there are two main camps when it comes to Soviet history. One camp is the Cold War warriors, with extremely high estimates that criticize historians with lower estimates for defending Stalin and refusing to accept facts. The other camp is the revisionists, who have criticized the Cold War warriors for using second-hand sources and presenting hard-to-justify figures. Side note, before we get into the numbers, it's easy to accuse lower estimators as irrationally defending Stalin. But it's ridiculous to do that, because 3 million deaths is not somehow better than 7 million deaths. There was obviously huge amounts of suffering, and trying to determine the historical record doesn't undermine that fact. What does it mean to be a death under Stalin? Some historians calculate the birth rate before Stalin and then the population after Stalin and use the deficit to calculate his death count. But this is not only an incredibly wrong way to count death, it also counts people who weren't born and ignores the fact that war and tumultuous periods typically lower birth rates. Other historians count famine deaths or World War II deaths as those killed by Stalin, while others only count overtly intentional killings. Others just seem to have used rumors or guesses to come up with their claims. However, archival evidence during this time has been released and cooled down the debate a bit. The paper, Victims of the Soviet Penal System in the Pre-War Years, uses official archival data to refute and confirm old conclusions, specifically about the Great Purges. According to the paper, the long-awaited archival evidence on the repression in the period of the Great Purges shows that the level of arrests, political prisoners, executions, and general camp populations tend to confirm the orders of the magnitude indicated by those labeled as revisionists, and mocked by those proposing higher estimates. The paper goes on to refute old claims about the terror targeting specific nationalities and confirm that only a minority were imprisoned for political reasons. It also confirms that the purges mainly targeted elites and was characterized by general confusion. But if you truly want to appreciate how bloated Stalin's numbers can get, just take a look at this table from the paper. Most of the columns aren't filled out, so let's take a look at the 1937 to 38 total arrests and see the difference from reality and actual documentable data. Even if we assume that the documented archives are incorrect, adding a million deaths still wouldn't get anywhere close to the estimates of 20 million. The paper also goes on to roast the high estimate group by saying, mainstream published estimates of the total numbers of victims of repression in the late 1930s have ranged from Dmitry Volkogonov's 3.5 million to Olga Shatanevskaya's nearly 20 million. The bases for these assessments are unclear in most cases and seem to have come from guesses, rumors, or extrapolations from isolated local observation. As the table shows, the documentable number of victims are much smaller. The bloating of Stalin's death count into the tens of millions is not only historically inaccurate, but also in the direct interests of the ruling class. If someone bothers to complain about their working conditions, all they have to do is point at Stalin and say the alternative to capitalism is 60 million deaths and gulag camps. Speaking of which, gulags are often compared to Nazi death camps, but this is an unfair comparison. According to the paper from earlier, when looking at official archival evidence, many of the inmates in the gulag camps were freed and death rates were low. Only a minority of the inmates were convicted of being counter-revolutionary, with most being there for general crimes. Although it is important to take these distinctions with a grain of salt, this also opens up an important dialogue about why we shouldn't count all arrests in the Soviet penal system, because some were just arrests of general criminals that would have been arrested anyway in a Western society. So, Gulag camp populations are more comparable to US prison populations, which ironically most people arguing about gulags probably don't care about. Many people love to point out that Stalin killed more than Hitler, but there are many issues in that statement. As we saw earlier, Stalin's death count can vary by tens of millions depending on what you count and the method you use to get it. Hitler killed around 11 to 25 million people, while Stalin killed anywhere from 3 to 50 million people. Sure, you could cherry pick numbers to make Stalin look worse than Hitler, but the opposite's also true. So while saying Stalin killed more than Hitler is technically correct, I could say that Hitler killed more than Stalin and have that same sense of satisfaction. Taking a step back from the Stalin was worse than Hitler train of thought to put to rest the idea that Stalin and Hitler were besties. There's been this strange idea in general that communism and Nazism are essentially the same thing. Nazi does stand for National Socialism, right? Well, misnomers are a thing? You know, you ever heard of them? Do you people just think misnomers are made up by cultural Marxists to trick people into believing the no-no things? You know, North Korea's official name is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Does that mean they're a Democratic People's Republic? Actually, yes they are. Forget the comparison. But anyway, remnants of socialism in the Nazi Party were all purged in the Night of Long Knives when Hitler killed anyone resembling a political dissident. Communists were also brought to concentration camps, and Karl Marx's Jewish roots certainly didn't help. Although the Nazis and Soviets did have a non-aggression pact, that was only after Stalin tried and failed to form an anti-Nazi coalition with Britain and France, who were following a policy of appeasement to Germany. The supposed friendship of Stalin and Hitler is also very strange when considering the fact that Stalin's Soviet Union was the main opponent of Nazi Germany, fighting years before a Western front was even opened. For the pleb tier viewers who don't know what the Holodomor is, it's essentially a famine that took place in Ukraine from 1932 to 1933, often attributed to Stalin. However, many like to call the Holodomor a genocide caused by Stalin, and it's very strange to do that when there was already a poor harvest at the time. Stalin's policies did play a role in the famine, I'm not denying that. He requisitioned grain in large amounts, and this happened to affect Ukraine worse because they were an important agricultural center. However, this wasn't deliberately targeted at Ukraine, and this can be seen in the way that other parts of Russia suffered as well. Certain peasants also hoarded grain and slaughtered their own livestock to fight the collectivization movement. Imagine a country with near full employment, free healthcare, free education, and rough income inequality. Does that sound impossible? Well, it did exist. It was the Soviet Union. While the United States and other capitalist countries were suffering from the Great Depression, the Soviet Union was doing fine and its planned economy was growing reliably each year. Compared to the bigotry of the United States, the Soviet Union was also great in terms of race relations. As civil rights activist Paul Robeson put it, "In Russia I felt for the first time like a full human being. No color prejudice like in Mississippi, no color prejudice like in Washington. It was the first time I felt like a human being." So, if you were a person of color, poor, or a member of the working class, you would actually be thriving in the Soviet Union. Many Americans are born with this Cold War era idea that the Soviet Union was a police state ruled by a dictator who maintained control by destroying freedom of speech. But look at the United States. Now we have the government spying on us every second, and I'm probably on some kind of list for making this video. It's strange that the people who criticize the policies of a country that's been gone for about 3 decades stay silent about their own country's policies, which they actually have influence over. It's difficult to have a productive conversation about Stalin without being flooded by 5th grade gotcha remarks that don't really mean anything and only work to poison the conversation. We've already covered many of them in this video, like Stalin killed more than Hitler, or Stalin and Hitler were Facebook friends, or in the Soviet Union you were literally unable to breathe without being arrested by the secret police. However, just because most of these arguments against Stalin are misrepresentations, many are legitimate. For example, Stalin's treatment of homosexuals was wrong, hopefully for obvious reasons. Okay, let's just pause and take a moment to look at that face. What a nice boy. His undoing of social reforms from Lenin was also a bad move. Who run the world, girls? Who run the world, girls? And as mentioned previously, he also could have dealt with the famine in a much better way. Why defend the legacy of a man who's been dead for over half a century? It's because the ruling class likes to use Stalin as a talking point. Everywhere you can see comparisons of people to Stalin, as if he were the devil. But almost always, the United States has done the same, if not worse. It's easy to condemn the atrocities that occurred decades ago under a country that hasn't existed for about 30 years. What's harder to do is something about the atrocities of today committed by us that we have control over. While American nationalists gleefully talk about the Soviet Union's purges and the Holodomor, they remain silent about the US's ongoing support of the Yemen Civil War and the apartheid state of Israel. They ignore the brutality of the police and the growing mass surveillance program. This isn't to deflect from the bad parts of Stalin's Soviet Union, certainly just because the US does many of the same things doesn't justify either, but after hearing criticism of the Soviet Union's secret police, prison camps, authoritarian methods of maintaining control, and how it was an undemocratic hellscape, it's time to look in the mirror. Wow, what a controversial video. I'm sure to get a lot of nice reactions from the YouTube community. I'm bracing for the angry commenters already that ignore the whole thing and just posted something like, "Communism killed 100 million people," or something about helicopter rides. I already know that people are gonna say, "Wow, replace Stalin with Hitler and the Holodomor with the Holocaust and this guy sounds like a Nazi." In response, I say, if I replaced Stalin with fried chicken in this video, I would sound like a staunch defender of chicken. What's your point? Obviously changing words in a sentence will change the meaning of the sentence. But if you do have legitimate criticisms of the video or anything I put in it, feel free to comment though. I don't want to be the kind of jerk that dismisses any counter-evidence as capitalist propaganda. But seriously, this was a long video to make. It took like a month to animate everything. I'll probably choose something easier to talk about next time. Anyway, if you're not a leftist or haven't heard this before, thanks for making it to the end of the video. Even if you don't agree, it's always good to keep an open mind. And as always, no war but the class war.